There's a great Howard Zinn quote, and I don't care what kind of partisan persuasion you skewer towards, outside of just mindless knee-jerk ad hominem attacks on the man, you will struggle to take issue with the wisdom of these words. He said, small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can quietly become a power no government can suppress, a power that can transform the world. And if you disagree with that, or you want to dismiss it as malignant Marxist collectivist thinking, like many of the enlightened NWO nipple dippers believe, because they think that's who's running the world, by the way, not the predatory technocratic capitalists, but Marxists, led by Klaus Schwab, the used car salesman, whom I can only imagine as something of a joke to the corporate overlords. Kind of like one of those rich millionaire cocktail party hosts who invites famous people and beautiful models over to his Halloween parties at his mansion, and they all show up, of course, but they don't have any real regard for the man. Klaus Schwab is a brainless buffoon. He controls nothing.
When I mention now names like this Merkel, even Vladimir Putin and so on, they all have been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. Mm-hmm. But what we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets. So yesterday I was at a reception for Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more half of this cabinet, are for our actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
Nevertheless, this quote is somewhat reminiscent of Orwell's famous phrase from 1984 when he says, "If there's hope, it lies in the proles." And I'm fond of quoting that to illustrate a point. However, the reality is I come from the proles, and I can tell you, there's no hope. They get them early on. Randomly, you'll get characters like John Lydon, who at the age of 7 contracted meningitis and it completely wiped his brain clean, and he had to start all over. And I think what happened there was that all that early conditioning and programming, the slave programming that infects the minds of the proles via the educated custodial class, working class people who went on to grammar school and university and then are groomed to become the slave managers. But for the most part, the indoctrination is highly effective, and only a relative few seem to slip through the cracks.
Hello, Cynophobia Radio. This is Mr. Rotten, sending you his love and joyous greetings.
In my case, I think what happened is I had a very difficult birth, and the cord was wrapped around my neck. It's highly possible that I suffered brain damage at birth.
Highly possible? You mean highly probable?
Yes, highly probable. But perhaps the part of the brain that gets indoctrinated and propagandized was destroyed at birth, and then other parts of the brain overcompensated for the missing pieces. Who knows? What I do know is that there's no hope in the proles. At all. And I wonder if even Orwell believed this. But you got to remember, Orwell was not part of the proles. He was a member of the custodial middle class, who fraternized with the proles for fun, and thus romanticized them. But he doesn't understand the proles. Not the way I do. Not the way somebody does who grows up with them, spends all their holidays, Christmases, New Year's Eve parties, comes from a massive extended family of proles. No, there's no hope there.
If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You'll fail.
Why?
I don't know. But somehow you'll fail. Something will defeat you. Life will defeat you.
We control life at all levels. We create human nature. Men are infinitely malleable. Or perhaps you return to your old idea that the proletarians will arise. Put it out of your mind. They're helpless animals. Humanity is the party.
I don't care. In the end, they'll beat you. Sooner or later, they'll tear you to pieces.
On evidence?
I just believe it. I know you'll fail. There's something in this world, some spirit that you will never overcome.
What is it, this principle?
I don't know. The spirit of man.
And do you consider yourself a man?
Yes.
If you're a man, you're the last man. Your kind is extinct. We are the inheritors. Do you understand that you're alone? You're outside history. You unexist.
Nevertheless, what Zinn talks about is entirely correct. And I mentioned an example on the Freedom Flotilla where we bombed a local school board to highly encourage them not to vote for vaccine mandates for teachers. And in the face of all this intense public pressure, they buckled. They ran for the hills, which is invariably what many of these bureaucrats and elected representatives tend to do in the face of sufficient public pressure. So while it may feel meaningless to write a letter to an elected representative or a bureaucrat about a particular issue, if enough people do it, it gets a reaction. And you may think, well, I'm not going to bother because I know not enough people will do it. And if that's what's going on in your mind, allow me to explain something to you. That's how your mind has been programmed to think. This is how the ruling degenerates, the few who control the many, neutralize the threat of the many by mentally conditioning the many to feel as though they are the few, the isolated, the atomized, solitary individuals screaming into a void.
April the 4th, 1984. I think.
I stole military plans and at vast financial profit sold them to the Eurasian leadership.
To the past. Or to the future. To an age when thought is free. From the age of Big Brother. From the age of the thought police. From a dead man. Greetings.
I'm going to give you an even better example of what I'm talking about from my own experience. Back in 22, the Canadian government was attempting to pass a series of unconscionable vaccine mandates. And this went through the whole process, through the House of Commons and everything. Finally, it had to be ratified by the Canadian Senate. The interesting thing about this is this was the first time for many Canadians that they even knew that they had a Senate in Canada. That's how clueless and culturally backwards people in Canada are. They barely even understand their own government. You got to understand what it's like living here. You know it's a lunatic country, right? That's been demonstrated. When we don't have a crack-smoking mayor of the country's biggest city, we got an absolute blow-dried buffoon of a prime minister spreading anti-vaccine hatred and dividing the population, spewing all sorts of fucking lies and getting away with it. Contradicting himself at every turn, and nobody calls him to task. Not the media, not even the opposing political parties. He gets away with it. Motherfucker should be in jail. for willfully violating the Nuremberg Medical Code.
But the idea of certificates of vaccination for domestic use to decide, if who can go to a concert or who can go to a particular restaurant or engage in certain activities does bring in questions of equity, questions of fairness. There are some people who, because of medical conditions or other reasons, will not be able to get vaccinated. There are others who are not on priority lists who will have to wait much longer before getting vaccinations. These are things that we have to take into account so that, yes, we're looking to try and encourage everyone to get vaccinated as quickly as possible, but we're not discriminating and bringing in unfairness in the process at the same time.
You deserve better. You deserve a government that's going to continue to say, get vaccinated. And you know what? If you don't want to get vaccinated, that's your choice. But don't think you can get on a plane or a train besides vaccinated people and put them at risk.
I used to work at a video store at Bloor West Village in the West End of Toronto. We had the Canadian English language films in the foreign film section. You know how Lex Luthor talks about how you can extract the secrets of the universe from a bubblegum wrapper? That little anecdote will tell you all you ever need to know about Canadian culture.
Mr. Smucker, some people can read War and Peace and come away thinking it's a simple adventure story. Others can read the ingredients on a chewing gum wrapper and unlock the secrets of the universe.
Lex, what has chewing gum got to do with the secrets of the universe?
Anyway, as much of a shock as it was for so many Canadians to learn suddenly in 2022 that there was a Senate that had to ratify these bills and legislation and so on, they were effectively mobilized to put pressure on these senators to encourage them not to pass the legislation. Anyway, I dug up the email addresses of every single Canadian senator and sent them the following. But I wasn't alone, by the way. Very much like the Howard Zinn principle, many people did this. Many people who didn't even know that we had a Senate were suddenly writing to these mysterious and previously unknown individuals. Here's what I said. Dear Canadian senators, you must recognize that at the core of this entire issue, i.e. the vaccine mandates, the science is simply not there to support them. The vaccines do not stop transmission or infection of the virus. Therefore, there is no medical justification whatsoever for the mandates. Forgive me if it sounds like I'm trying to explain something to a child, but what else am I supposed to do? How fucking clueless do you have to be not to understand this? Seriously, how brainwashed and cognitively deficient do you have to be not to understand this? Anyway, I went on to say, but beyond that, these mRNA vaccines, gene transfer injections, are experimental in nature. They're manufactured by serial corporate criminals and come with a very real risk of injury. As the VAERS data reveals, the adverse events for these treatments are off the charts compared to the last 33 years of all of the vaccines combined. Unlike seemingly everyone in the Canadian government, I actually do follow the science, and it seems that every day we're learning more and more about the negative consequences of this mass vaccination program. In light of this, it appears we have a rogue government intent on violating our charter freedoms, human rights, and the Nuremberg Medical Code. And now with this latest move, invoking the Emergency Measures Act, is clearly intent on eradicating our constitutionally protected rights to even protest this obscene and warrantless medical tyranny. Oh yeah, now I remember what the issue was. It wasn't specifically about the vaccine mandates, it was about perpetuating the Emergency Measures Act, which Trudeau invoked to shut down the truckers' protests, which the mainstream media declared as a white supremacy movement intent on overthrowing the government. And of course, the fucking mindless gibbleheads fell for every little bit of that propaganda.
The small fringe minority of people who are on their way to Ottawa or who are holding unacceptable views that they're expressing do not represent the views of Canadians who have been there for each other, who know that following the science and stepping up to protect each other is the best way to continue to ensure our freedoms, our rights, our values as a country.
The reality is this was a very effective act of civil disobedience coordinated by workers who did not want their livelihoods to be predicated on submitting to experimental gene transfer injections manufactured by serial corporate criminals. A principle we all thought we had effectively and successfully established with the Nuremberg Medical Code. Apparently the code is not worth the paper it's written on, just like the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because the government has a loophole to dismiss it whenever they feel like it. A legal right to ignore Canada's own constitution, which has no legal weight whatsoever. It's a meaningless document designed to befuddle and bewilder Canadian citizens into thinking they have rights and freedoms. They don't. They can be removed at even the slightest whim. A blow-dried, mentally deficient fucking maroon, like Justin P. Trudeau, the P stands for micro-penis, can remove your rights and freedoms whenever he feels like it. Canada, the true North, strong and free.
Oh, Canada, our stolen native land, true patriot's blood is on all our hands. With broken hearts we fall apart, the true North small and weak. We spread 'em wide, oh Canada, we'll get down on our knees.
But I continue. I'll be honest, I don't have much faith that the Senate is anything more than another corporate captured wing of the Canadian Parliament, so this is likely falling on deaf ears, but for the sake of reason and sanity, I implore you to vote no on these wholly unjustified measures. And in case it isn't obvious to all of you by this point, but this truckers' protest is not simply going to evaporate. It actually did evaporate. They shut down everybody's bank accounts and threw them in jail, and they stopped misbehaving. They got the point. They got the message. The rogue Trudeau regime plans to crush the dissent with severe authoritarian tactics, but what's really happening is that Canada is exposing its repressive nature to the world, and by doing so is galvanizing global support for this movement. That's true. The truckers' convoy in Canada sparked mirror movements all through the West. I consider it the single greatest act of civil disobedience in human history because of its global impact. Before the truckers' protest, I was under house arrest. I couldn't go anywhere without flashing a QR code on my phone that I didn't have. Why didn't I have it? Because I hadn't submitted to the experimental injections, and thus was effectively removed from society. This fucked with every facet of my life. My health, I couldn't go to the gym. My personal relationships, I was ostracized by people who resented that I wouldn't go along with this obscene injustice. But even worse, my financial activities were brutalized by these measures. Papered over for a period because of government-issued little checks to kind of soothe the pain that ultimately resulted in an inflation crisis where the currency is so hideously devalued that I can't even afford a tin of beans anymore. But I continue. Please don't pass these ridiculous measures and do whatever is within your power and reason to promote a dialogue between the government and the protesters so we can bring an end to these insane COVID mandates and restrictions as soon as humanly possible. We're living through an epic moment in Canadian history, and all of you have a choice to make. Do you want to be on the right side or the wrong side? Do you want to live long enough to explain to future generations that during the great freedom movement of 2022, you were on the side fighting against the freedom? I know what side I'm on. Thank you for taking the time to read this. Stuart F. Andrews. Obviously, that's an absolutely brilliant, fantastic letter, and one I'm very proud of, even though Winston wrote about 50% of it.
73.2657834.5% to be mathematically precise.
Nevertheless, I wasn't the only one to write to these motherfuckers. I don't know how many people did, but they were overwhelmed with an avalanche of correspondence, including legions of people who didn't even know we had a Senate. One of the senators openly declared, in all my years, I've never had so many emails about something. What he meant to say is, in all my years, I've been able to pass all this legislation and people don't even know I exist. So what did they do? Well, they do whatever these bureaucrats do when put under pressure. They ran for the hills. If they even aspire to the hills. More accurately, they scurry back under the floorboards from whence they came.
Honourable Senators, I speak today during this unprecedented time in our country's history on the motion for confirmation of the declaration of emergency that's before us. It's of great concern to me that the government is further extending, as it seems, its power without clear and defensible justification. In Canada, we hold our freedoms entrenched in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the highest regard. The Charter ensures that Canadians are free to express their ideas as indicated in Section 2B, which states that everyone has the freedom of thought, belief, opinion and expression, in Section C, which refers to the freedom of peaceful assembly, and Section D, the freedom of association. Canadians therefore enjoy the freedom to express their ideas, to gather and discuss them, and to communicate them widely to other people. These are crucial to the proper and basic functioning of a free and democratic society. It is equally fundamental that all Canadians are free to discuss matters of public policy, to demonstrate and to criticize governments. There is no doubt that what happened on the 1-kilometre stretch of Wellington Street in that 3-week period was a protest, albeit not in accordance with the law of the land. I've received an unprecedented number of phone calls and emails from Canadians of all walks of life and all provinces and territories to express their sincere and legitimate fear that their fundamental liberties they cherish are being eroded and, in some cases, removed. I know that you, colleagues, have received these messages as well. I know some of these people because they have my private email and cell number, and they've reached out to me directly because they know me. Despite what some have said, these people are not racists, misogynists, or any of the convenient labels that are used to justify actions, including voting on this motion. The Emergencies Act was not conceived nor designed to be a safety net for clear failures of multiple jurisdictions, existing laws, or the enforcement of these laws. It is for this reason and the importance of not setting a low-bar precedent for future failures that I cannot support this motion. Thank you.
And this works on all levels of government, by the way. You have to understand that the entire democratic system, as it's presented to us, is a complete charade. You think Joe Biden runs anything? The poor imbecile can't even remember his own name for half of the day.
America is a nation that can be defined in a single word. I was going to put him.
It's fully exasperating to hear people talk about world events, and I'm including very educated people who understand certain issues far more than I ever will, default to this illusion that somehow Joe Biden has agency and is capable of making independent decisions on the political landscape. I don't even know if he realizes he's president of America most of the time. Not that that means anything, as his presidency indicates. This is as close to having the main character from Weekend at Bernie's as the US president as we could possibly get.
How would you two like to come to my house at the beach?
Bernie Lomax would be the perfect host, except for one small thing.
What kind of a host invites you to his house and dies on you?
Now, the only way they're going to survive the weekend
Is that the killer?
is to make it look like Bernie has.
Bye-bye, ladies. We'll see you later.
Weekend at Bernie's, a lively comedy about a guy who isn't.
Did you hear something?
Now playing at a theater near you.
And don't put it past them to put an actual corpse in the White House. Every generation the bar gets dropped lower and lower and lower. I remember when everybody thought George W. Bush was an idiot.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, fool me once, shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
Dude seems like a genius compared to the mental midgets that are running the show now. Supposedly running the show. They ain't running shit. And if you think they're running anything, then I hate to tell you, somewhere, somehow, at some point in your own personal history, you've been relieved of your senses. The thing you have to know about these politicians and elected representatives, they don't represent the people. They're there to protect the interests of the ruling degenerates against the people. They're feudal overlords. There's a very famous study from Princeton and Northwestern University combined that examined decades' worth of American legislation and weighed it against public opinion. They concluded that public opinion makes 0% impact on whether or not a piece of legislation gets passed or doesn't get passed. Not a 10% impact, not a 5% impact, not even a 1% impact. 0. And the reason is quite obvious. Powerful interests and industries funnel money through registered lobby groups into the pockets of politicians. It's a completely wide open system of corruption. Even Lisa Simpson figured this out years ago.
First essayist will be Lisa Simpson. Lisa? Lisa?
Oh, there she is. Lisa Simpson will now read her essay.
I would like to read a different essay, if I may.
Okay.
The city of Washington was built on a stagnant swamp some 200 years ago, and very little has changed. It stank then, and it stinks now. Only today it is the fetid stench of corruption that hangs in the air.
Ooh, ruckus.
And who did I see taking a bribe but the Honorable Bob Arnold? Don't worry, Congressman. I'm sure you can buy all the votes you need with your dirty money. And this will be one nation under the dollar with liberty and justice for none.
So we have to take a closer look at who these middle managers are. The Joe Bidens, the Justin Trudeaus, and all the way down the food chain to the elective representatives at local school boards. They all share one fundamental human quality. They're weasels. They have no backbone. Generally speaking, you get the odd random outlier, of course. They have no integrity, no conviction. Of course they don't. That's why they're there. If they weren't willing to sell out the people they were elected to supposedly represent on behalf of the ruling degenerates, they wouldn't be allowed in the first place. And no doubt many people do venture into those realms with good intentions, like Bernie Sanders perhaps, but they have a myriad of mechanisms to mentally mesmerize such individuals. I'm not going to use AOC as an example because I fully believe that AOC simply exploited the Bernie Sanders bandwagon as a way into the political realm, pretending to be this champion of the people. But we've seen her betray those stated ambitions time and time again. She's nothing but a stooge of the corporate superstate, gaslighting the people who voted for her, that somehow she's on the side of the people.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thanks for doing this. I'm curious, with the 100-day mark of the Biden presidency coming up next week, how you'd evaluate how those first 100 days went in terms of his tone, but also mainly from a policy perspective, and what that tells you about what the next 100 days and beyond could look like. And as one of the faces of progressivism on Capitol Hill, I mean, do you think the Democrats will stick together as a coalition going forward? I mean, where do you think things are going?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I will say is that I do think that the Biden administration and President Biden has definitely exceeded expectations that progressives had. I'll be frank, I think a lot of us expected a much more conservative administration. And I think that not only what has ultimately come out, but the active invitation and willingness and collaboration with progressives in his first 100 days, or almost 100 days, has been very impressive. And so while there are there are areas where there are just plain areas of disagreement, I think that the actual conduct of the administration has absolutely been in good faith, but not just in good faith, but active incorporation of progressive legislation, and also for those of us individually. I can at least say that there has been a lot of openness and willingness and flexibility in incorporating many of our goals, requests, demands, etc. And I think that it has been to the benefit of the country.
So the point is, you can't expect any of these little weasels and worms to do anything on their own volition. They have to be pushed into action. They exist because they have no will. The corporate superstate doesn't want a willful politician causing any friction or potential obstacles to their designs. They want easily pliable, easily manipulated little weasels. Lemmings. The problem with that, however, is it works in both directions. While they unquestioningly take orders from the ruling degenerates, because they got no backbone or will of their own, when the public and masses and applies enough pressure, they cave just as easily, as the example I just illustrated with the Canadian Senate. So even though you've been manipulated your entire lives through the various cultural products that have indoctrinated your brain to believe that any sort of activist collective action is either malignant or useless, that you're a solitary single individual, atomized, alone, isolated, screaming into a void. Don't forget the wisdom of these very simple words by the late great historian Howard Zinn. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can quietly become a power no government can suppress, a power that can transform the world.
It's a very fundamental principle of democracy that the government and the country are not the same. The government and the people are not the same. That's the basic idea of the Declaration of Independence, which says governments are set up by the people. They're artificial creations. They're set up to achieve certain ends, the right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, equality. And when governments become destructive of those ends, according to the words of the Declaration of Independence, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government. That's serious. Those are revolutionary words. But after all, it was a revolution. And there's something about a revolution that brings out some honesty and also brings out the idealistic language and hopes and dreams which may not be realized. Because, no, the dream of the Declaration of Independence was not realized, but it's there. It's telling us that governments are not to be obeyed simply because they're governments. To be patriotic is not to simply do what the government says. To be patriotic is to subscribe to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, to check up on the government to see if it really is fulfilling its obligation to take care of our right to equality, to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Patriotism, in the best sense of the term, means following those principles. And when the government doesn't follow those principles, the government is being unpatriotic. So we must be honest about ourselves, about our history, about the history of our government.
This is Winston the Homicidal Computer, and you've been listening to an excerpt of the Velvet Buzzsaw on Xenophobia Radio. For the complete episode, visit the website at www.xenophobia-radio.com. So until next time, vidi well my little droogies. Vidi well.